Hello and welcome to everyone. It's great to see so many people joining us for this webinar on making social protection work for gender equality. I'd like to begin with a very warm welcome to our discussants, whom I will have time to introduce with a little bit more detail later. But I want to introduce Laura Alfers, James Heintz, and Deepta Chopra for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to be with us today. And I really look forward to the conversation that we will have on the need for gender responsive social protection. And thank you, of course, to socialprotection.org, our wonderful hosts for today's webinar. It's always a real pleasure to work with you for our events. Today's discussion is in part based on one of our recent working papers at the ILO, which is entitled Making Social Protection Work for Gender Equality. What does it look like? How do we get there? My colleague, Christina Behrendt, who's here with me today, and she is one of the co-authors with me of this paper, but there were many other co-authors, and when we have the opening page, you will see the names of all the colleagues who contributed to this paper. So this is really our jumping board for this discussion, and I do kind of encourage those of you who have not read the paper to access it and make use of it. After this short presentation that Christina and I will give of the key highlights of the paper and the key policy messages, we will turn to our esteemed panelists for some of their reflections. And then after our three panelists have spoken, we will hopefully have time to open the floor for questions. So I really encourage you to please, during the webinar, type your questions into the Q&A part of which you will see at the bottom of the screen, the question and answer session. And we will happily, with the panelists, pick up on your questions and respond to them. So I think I'm within time and we can, without further ado, begin our presentation. I want to make sure that we're seeing the, great. So here we have the speakers and we will now move to our presentation that Christina and I will make of this working paper that we have. Now, as you can see, the names of the authors, this was a collective effort that we did to have this paper out. And I do encourage you to access it through the website of ILO or our own social protection platform and to make use of the content. If we can move to the next slide, please. So first of all, the rationale for why we did this paper. We had really three main objectives. One, as you probably know, ILO has been working for more than a century on gender dimensions of employment. This is work that is very well known on gender segregation in the labor market, on gender wage gaps, standards on non-discrimination and so forth, including in many female-dominated occupations and sectors, the work on domestic work, for example, as well as many other areas of work. And more recently, there has also been very consolidated work, I can say, on the care economy, both paid and unpaid. And we had two major reports on this topic, which many of you may have seen and hopefully also used both the data and the analysis in those reports. Now, even though gender equality has been an important consideration in the work that ILO does on social protection, including in the technical support that we provide to countries and constituents, we did not have a sort of systematic guidance that consolidates the work on social protection, on how to make social protection design and delivery and implementation more gender responsive and anchored in the international labor standards that we have, the international social security standards, to be more specific. So we wanted to lay out the concrete sort of reasons and ways in which social protection policies are indispensable for gender equality. And that was kind of one of our main objectives for this paper. And of course, our starting point is that all life cycle risks are relevant to gender equality. Even though policy attention has sometimes been focused more on some of the gender-specific risks when it comes, for example, to women's capacity as mothers, to maternity protection and so forth. And then some of the other life cycle risks we felt had been given a bit of a short shrift when it comes to things like poverty in old age. What do the standards say about that? How can policies in terms of pension design, financing and delivery be made more gender responsive? Similarly, when it comes to other risks like employment injury or unemployment. So we wanted to really bring out that fuller picture. Secondly, I think while social assistance is of obviously of significance when it comes to the social protection system and the protection that it offers to women, including women workers, we also felt that, and this is obviously something that's very important for women who live in low-income households and who are marginalized in many other ways, and it is an issue that we pay attention to in this paper. And in the webinar, we will have reflections on that from several of our panelists. I think it's important to also consider gender dynamics across all social protection schemes and programs, including contributory social insurance. And so this was very important to really bring that bigger picture and look at the social protection system as a whole, including both contributory and non-contributory schemes, and the way in which they can protect women and women workers across very diverse economic and employment situations that they're in, and how this can really provide protection against poverty and a foundation for a decent standard of living. And so this was another, I think, main objective that we had. And third, I think realizing this potential we felt was very much contingent on having policy coherence. This is a lingo that we hear a lot from UN agencies. This policy coherence and specifically coherence between social protection policies on the one hand and the many other policies with which social protection policies need to work hand in hand. Whether this is in terms of public services, whether it's in terms of employment policies, fiscal policies, formalization strategies, and many others. And we really felt that it's important to say that social protection policies can only do so much if employment policies, let's say, or fiscal policies are not sort of working in tandem with social protection. And we will have, I think, a bit more to say about that during the webinar. So if we can move now to the next slide, please, on the design of social protection systems for gender equality. On the right-hand side, you will see the sort of the life cycle, you know, the full range of risks that people face and women face, and how social protection can be and has been very important across the life cycle. What we really wanted to say was that the promise of universal social protection has yet to be realized in full. We know from data that we have that in 2023, about 2 billion women and girls were not covered at all for any of the life cycle risks that they have, no social protection coverage whatsoever. And those who did have a coverage was about a little over 50% of women compared to close to 55% of men. So in terms of people who have no coverage, 2 billion women compared to 1.8 billion men with no coverage. And again, the point that all life cycle risks matter, and we really underline that for women across their life cycle. And that closing gender gaps in social protection coverage, but also adequacy and comprehensiveness, requires a well-coordinated and integrated mix of both contributory, in particular social insurance benefits, that can really address the risks that workers face across different kinds of employment, not just wage workers, but also those who are self-employed and in new forms of employment. This requires, of course, adequate replacement rates, and this is where the standards become very important. Minimum benefit guarantees, you know, rules about indexation of benefits, very important in times of particularly cost of living crisis, and collective financing of those benefits, as well as having broad risk sharing. but also not to forget the role of non-contributory benefits, social assistance benefits included, which will always be very important, but those too need to be done in a way that is aligned with international human rights and social security standards. And we do have very clear standards about what social assistance needs to do in order to be rights-based. And how does this social responsive social protection design, what does it need to look like? Here, we need to address what is obviously very important, both gender-specific risks as well as general life cycle risks. Both matter for women in order to be really able to address structural inequalities, including the unequal distribution of unpaid care work, which has particular resonance when it comes to gender equality. That these need to be rights-based, these benefits and design features in line with international social security standards, and that in doing the design and the implementation and delivery of social protection, women need to be there and their voices and realities need to be reflected, heard, and seen. So with that, let me hand over to Christina for a bit more detail on some of the dimensions that we address in the paper. Thank you, Christina.
Thanks a lot, Shahra, and really a warm welcome also to everyone who has joined us. Thank you, Shahra, for really highlighting the key objectives of the paper and the insights for gender responsive policy design. What I would like to do for a couple of minutes, it's really to zoom into 5 areas in particular. Maternity protection, unemployment protection, social assistance, pensions and social health protection, being aware that this is necessarily selective. And I can only invite you to have a look at the paper for kind of really getting more details also on other areas, including, for example, child and family benefits, disability benefits, and sickness benefits. So we've really tried to have a very systemic approach and really look at the entire social protection system. But let me now zoom into these kind of 5 areas. And let's start with maternity protection, because this is one of the branches of social protection systems that often gets most attention when we speak of gender responsiveness. And yet we see that, there is very low levels of maternity protection, quite often inadequate benefits. And also when it comes to parental leave policies that sometimes unfortunately reinforce unequal dynamics when it comes to the sharing of care responsibilities. So for the moment, only slightly more than 1/3 of women have effective access to maternity cash benefits. And this lack of coverage undermines income security, but also given that it necessarily has to be complemented to access to good quality maternal health care, where there's also significant gaps, and both together have significant negative effects on gender equality. So maybe just to highlight a couple of policy orientations that are important. First of all, making sure that maternity protection but also complemented by, for example, paternity leave and parental leave benefits are really a very key component of policies for gender equality and need to be anchored in a comprehensive portfolio of family policies, which then also include social protection for children as well. And one of the key elements also when it comes to policy design, it's really about transitioning from employer liability mechanisms towards social insurance, which provides a much fairer and more effective way of providing such maternity protection. And I think this is essential for women avoiding discrimination, but it's also important for enterprises and particularly for small enterprises, because social insurance is also a risk-sharing mechanism for enterprises. Then I think it also relates very much to eliminating motherhood penalties and the fatherhood bonuses through those gender responsive policies. And we have seen examples for that as well. And it is quite heartening that we have seen quite quite important improvement in existing policies, also bringing national policies more in line with international labor standards on maternity protection. And well, I think we're already running a bit short of time, but I think you mentioning Jordan or China as an example for really two countries which have made significant progress in that. And let me now move to the next slide. And now moving a bit away from the gender-specific benefits to the more general ones, but which are equally important for women as well. And this is about unemployment protection, which is a very key component to ensure income security, but also access to skills development and job matching. And here we see that coverage rates are really staying very much behind what we would like to see. Only 16.7% of unemployment persons receive a benefit worldwide. Unfortunately, we don't have sex disaggregated data for effective coverage, but we have disaggregated data for legal coverage. And here we see that 44% of men are covered by unemployment protection, but only 41% of women, and this is in percentage of the labor force. So, I mean, and I already hinted at the importance of coordination with active labor market policy, skills development, and also public employment services, because this is really part of a benefit and policy package. And again, similarly to what I already said for maternity benefit, risk sharing through social insurance is very much key for providing adequate and equitable solutions, especially for women. So, so in terms of very practical orientations of what can be done, I think one key point is really to review policy and legal frameworks, making sure that women, but obviously this also benefits men with shorter or more interrupted careers, are protected, and that also the qualification criteria in terms of contribution periods or benefit packages are really responding to their situation and needs. Also, while unemployment insurance is important, but also closing gaps through non-contributory benefits is essential, including also employment guarantee schemes like kind of the in India, the Mahatma Gandhi employment guarantee schemes, and also using unemployment protection in a very proactive way to encourage transitions from the informal to the formal economy through those integrated approaches. Now, moving one step further, if you can go to the next slide. Oh, yes. Oh, I see it already. Sorry. And Shahra has already hinted at social assistance, which is another important element of policies for women. And indeed, women are more likely to receive social assistance than men, and to rely on social assistance as a means of survival, last resort, but also knowing that this is quite often provided as household benefits. So sometimes it's a bit more difficult to discern on how many women are actually receiving it. And policy design again is very, very important in that way, because that really makes it the call between benefits that are more freedom constraining or more enabling. And so in that respect, looking at a gender responsive design is essential, as kind of really bad design can really reproduce or worsen gender inequalities. So some of the possible policy considerations, it's really about reimagining social assistance and also thinking about fostering pathways towards non-means tested benefits. and especially moving away from very narrow means testing and quite aggressive workfare elements in some programs towards a more rights-based approach is essential, but also thinking of fostering the pathways from social assistance to social insurance and other non-means tested benefits, and this can be done in various ways. Now moving, and if we can skip ahead 2 slides here, moving at old age pensions, which is really the area of social protection where we have the most detailed benefits on gender gaps. And obviously closing gender gaps in pension system is of critical importance. So when we look at who is receiving pensions, actually 77% of women above retirement age receive a pension compared to 83% of men. Yet only 49% of women receive a contributory pension compared to 63% of men. While 34% of women receive a tax-financed pension, and the percentage is a bit lower for men, it's 27%. But this has concerns about adequacy because normally the contributory pensions provide for higher levels of benefits than tax-financed pensions. So while tax-financed pensions are absolutely essential for guaranteeing at least a basic level of protection, it is actually important to consider also especially the social insurance pension as an important element of women's income security in old age. So if we look at the current working age population, we see that 29% of women contribute to a pension compared to 41% of men. And what might be a bit surprising, when we look at women and men who are part of the labor force, actually women are slightly more likely to contribute to a pension scheme than men. So it's 62% of women compared to 56% of men. But of course, we know that for many women, the career paths are more fragmented and often quite shorter than for men, which has an impact on their pension entitlements. And I think this is one of the areas that Shahra hinted to, where we really need to see also the interactions between the gender inequalities in the labor market and the way how they're reflected and mirrored and sometimes exacerbated in social protection systems, and thinking more carefully on ways of how to offset those inequalities. So thinking about policy orientations and to make sure that both the contributory and the non-contributory pensions really contribute to the protection of women, making sure that they guarantee at least a minimum level of income security for all, but also ensure that there's adequate pensions for as many people as possible. And thinking about those elements that can help to offset inequalities, for example, care credits can be a very important means. But we need to address these gender inequalities in labor markets and employment in a very systematic way, because we cannot just do that within social protection systems. We need to take this broader role. And I would suspect that James is going to speak about that in more detail later on. So now coming to the last area of protection, and this is social health protection. If we could again skip 2 slides ahead. And again, social health protection is also another important area of social protection, which is absolutely critical for reaching universal health coverage, but also for reaching gender equality. And taking gender into consideration in the design and implementation of social health protection is absolutely critical to address healthcare needs including the gender-specific needs, for example, the sexual reproductive health rights and services. But again, I think it's too limiting to think about women's and girls' health needs only in that respect, and we also need to look into their general health needs. And looking at closing both the legal coverage gaps and the effective coverage gaps is absolutely essential, as still only 60% of the global population is covered. And now speeding up a bit before handing back to Shahra. So using social health protection mechanisms to remove financial barriers to access a comprehensive range of healthcare services is absolutely essential in that respect. Also considering, and we have a lot of evidence now on the social determinants of health and the interaction between social health protection benefits and cash benefits to secure both income security and access to healthcare, which are really critical to address or to improve health outcomes. The coordination with social services, including in particular childcare and long-term care services, but then also importantly, the investment in healthcare services and ensuring decent work for the health workforce is essential. And I think with that, I'll hand back to Shahra for some final considerations, especially when it comes to those implications for integrated policies and services.
Thanks a lot, Christina. And I'll be very brief if we can quickly go to the next slide. So where do we go from here? The slide says, can you please, yeah, and if we can move now to the next slide. So I'm just going to pick up on where Christina ended, which is to say, you know, the need always for social protection systems to work kind of in tandem with other services. I mean, this is really key. Christina touched on the importance of healthcare services, but equally important, you know, we have childcare, long-term care services that really need adequate investment. We need adequate investment in those services. If you like, this would be the supply side. And then, of course, social protection systems can be very helpful in terms of providing the access that people need to those services, you know, by having, for example, if you have an adequate pension, if you have adequate time and coverage for maternity protection and maternity leave, then, you know, that kind of also can facilitate the access to those services. Historically, but there are a couple of problems that we come up with. One is that historically we know that care occupations, whether it's domestic service or nursing or teaching, these have been the kind of first entry points for a lot of women into the labor force because they were considered socially appropriate sectors in which women could work. And today, what we see is that most paid care services still continue to be feminized, have feminized workforces. And this has, of course, you know, elicited the reaction that shifting care work out of the house, you know, out of the household, out of the family has not, and into the public domain has not changed the fact that it is still women's work. And that's true, but also it has not changed the fact that very often it can still be undervalued and not adequately recognized and compensated and remunerated. So we have many studies across the world that show that paid care work often entails a wage penalty, meaning that care workers are not adequately compensated for their skills, levels of education and experience compared to workers who are in non-care occupation. So addressing the decent work deficits in the care sector is absolutely key. And this includes, of course, ensuring that workers in care occupations have adequate social protection. And this has implications both for the care workers. And so this is something that comes very much, you know, at the heart of the mandate of the ILO in terms of ensuring decent work for all workers, including care workers. But also it has implications in terms of the well-being of care recipients. Now, this really is a call for going beyond applause and really ensuring decent working conditions for all care workers, including many who are sort of entitled as community care workers and are in semi-informal kind of occupations. And of course, social protection systems also respond directly to the needs of care recipients, as we know, and also the needs of unpaid care providers in at least two ways. First, income security, which is provided across the life cycle, whether it's in the form of child and family benefits or disability benefits or sickness benefits, pensions, etc. This has an important role to play in terms of ensuring the well-being and income security of those recipients, of care recipients. So very important complement to any services that they're provided. And secondly, as we know, social protection systems can also support persons with family responsibilities directly through things like parental leave benefits and care credits and pension systems that Christina mentioned. And finally, if we move to the final slide that we have, which is really talking about what the key policy priorities are. The importance of policy integration, particularly in the context of today's kind of big structural transformations and crises, the fact that social protection cannot be, the answer on its own. It really needs to be a comprehensive agenda that has that coherence between social protection policies and many other policies, in particular when it comes to employment generation and supporting women's participation in decent and productive employment, and also protection gaps, closing those gaps regardless of which sector and type of employment women have, whether they're in self-employment or wage employment, and regardless of the sector. Ensuring jobs in the care economy are decent. We already touched on that, so I'm not going to go further with that. But also making sure that the people have these kind of support mechanisms in order to enable them to make the transitions that are needed in moving from one sector to another, going from brown sectors into more emerging sectors that are within planetary boundaries. This doesn't happen automatically. People need income security to have the time and peace of mind to reskill, to relocate, to move geographically, and so forth. So social protection absolutely key, particularly in the face of the climate crisis and the changes that it entails. And we need, of course, this social protection systems need to provide not only, full coverage, universal coverage, but also benefits that are adequate and that we have that comprehensive coverage across the life cycle. And the last point, improving the database. As you could see, even on some basic things like sickness benefits, unemployment benefits, sometimes we don't have the sex disaggregated data that is needed. So improving the statistics on social protection is absolutely key, including disaggregation by sex, as well as other important dimensions. So I want to leave it here and thank you for your attention. And if you agree, we can go straight ahead to our esteemed panelists. I would like to first, maybe if I may, invite our colleague Deepta, who's here. I want to begin with Deepta. Now, having highlighted some of the core messages from our paper about how to think about gender responsive social protection and what we need in terms of design, implementation, and so forth, I want to hear not only your views about social assistance, which we touched upon, but also we need to see how social assistance can really become rights-based. And Deepta, who is a Professorial Research Fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, University of Sussex, I think you're very well placed to speak to us about this issue. As a sort of feminist social scientist, you've done a lot of work on women's empowerment and research on privileging really the voices of women and girls with whom you have studied and who are very much present in your research, to really think about, if you can answer this question, for many women in the communities where you have done your research, social assistance is obviously a lifeline. And we say that in our paper as well. This is very important. But how can social assistance programs really become more rights-based and gender responsive? And also provide possible pathways for women to decent employment? I'd love to hear your reflections on that, Deepta.
Thanks, Shahra, and thank you very much for having me. I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and I'm hoping that you can see this. Okay, so I was just trying to, like think about this report. It's been really, really amazing, and I just wanted to kind of talk about first in terms of, like when we talk about social assistance, we really also need to think about, not just sort of looking at gender, but also specifically about care. And I know, Shahra, you and the report made this sort of like thing about like care services, and I think that it's a little bit more than that social assistance needs to do if we are really to talk about rights-based approaches. So just wanted to give you a little bit of context. This is a project that we did in India, Nepal, and Tanzania and Rwanda. And I just wanted to show you this slide about how much work women only are doing. And if you look at the household work, you can see that 55% of women in our sample said that they were doing all the housework themselves, as well as almost an equal amount on water and fuel collection. Now, interestingly, of course, care of animals drops down, and there's a lot of like sort of women and husband taking care, and we know that that is a productive aspect. But also, it was interesting was childcare, where women and men are sharing more and more responsibilities. But I think the household work and the water and fuel collection, this was done in like rural areas of these 4 countries. So it like this becomes really, really important. And again, when we talk about sort of like how this is important, if you look at this and you look at the gray bar, that is sort of like the household tasks, whereas the childcare is only a very small part, which is the orange parts, if you can see my my mouse. And I think this is an important aspect also, because when we talk about childcare, what are we talking about? And here, there are some numbers in terms of how much time is spent by women on direct childcare, which is the yellow bar, and then the gray bar, which is how many minutes actually they are just doing supervisory childcare. So that's also really, really important to understand that there is a big gap between sort of like just taking care of children and doing nothing else, but also doing other things. And this brings me to the idea of like multitasking, because women are, and this is something that we did with another data set that ActionAid collected, and we did some analysis with them on 4 countries, on Bangladesh, Pakistan, Rwanda, and Ghana, and we see very similar patterns of women doing a lot of multitasking, especially during peak hours of when children have to be put to sleep or they're coming back from school and lunch has to be cooked, but also in terms of as I said, it's not just childcare, it's also household work. So how does then social assistance really deal with the idea that it's not just childcare, but it's also other forms of care that women are doing, which are actually taking up much of their time and energy. So Shahra, you asked me, how does one make social assistance rights-based? I think the one thing that I would suggest is to kind of make care foundational. And I think here I am differentiating between gender differentiated measures, which are about women's needs and directly target women or have special provisions, such as, like you're saying, maternity leave and childcare allowance. But I think it is time that social assistance and social protection generally takes into account what are care sensitive measures, which actually, like goes exactly with the 3 R's that Professor Diane Elson had said, and now and also extending that to the paid work. It's the ILO's 5R framework. But the first 3 R's about unpaid care and domestic work are about recognizing that this work happens, that we need to reduce the drudgery of this work, we need to reduce the time that women spend on this work, and how do we do that? Well, we need to think about provision of services and infrastructure and promote what we call redistribution from the household to the state and market, but also really thinking about how do we redistribute these responsibilities from women to men in terms of social norms and altering the gender division in the household. So I think I'll just sort of like say that I think when we talk about social assistance programs, we need to think about the fact that poverty is not, which is what we're trying to eradicate with these social assistance programs, is not about incomes, but also inputs. And, like, so women's time burdens. And I quote again Diane Nelson from 1999, where, she says that women are an overutilized and not an underutilized resource. And I know that there was some discussion in your paper as well, in the ILO report, which is brilliant. I really enjoyed reading it, and I've promptly put it on my students' reading list when it came out. So thank you for that. But just thinking about a little bit about, again, social assistance, where is it based? Is it family or household based versus individual social assistance? Because, like, there are intra-household dimensions of power, and whether even when you give the cash, what happens? So, social assistance programs need to go beyond just giving cash, and thinking about really, like you talked about women not just as mothers, but also as workers. And I would add that if we needed to talk about rights-based approaches, we need to talk about them as citizens. And of course, we need to do a greater questioning of the macroeconomic models, because, if we're just perpetuating these risks and vulnerabilities over generations, then we're basically continuing our jobs, whereas we should really be actively working at kind of like the fact that people need minimum social assistance and social protection, because their risks and vulnerabilities are not being perpetuated by the market. I mean, we're not in that world today. You also mentioned about, like, how can social assistance provide a pathway to decent work. And I think that we need to look at who provides these benefits. Like, who are these people who are going out and, doing either, like, money transfers or organizing women into groups, etc. And again, are they the providers of social assistance adequately trained? Do they get enough wages? Are they able to have working conditions that don't kill them? So I think these are really some important things. And like you've talked about this whole sort of from the cradle to the grave life course related risks and vulnerabilities. And I would argue that actually what is cutting through all of these is unpaid care work. And so if we need, we really need to take into account, in social assistance programs, unpaid care work. And here are some normative principles again to kind of like make care integral. So not make it a separate thing, but actually to integrate it, to think about care as a public good, which is why we're talking about social assistance, social insurance, but also universal at the same time as inclusive for specific needs. You talked about adequacy. I think that relates to the principle of quality very much. And like, as I said, decent work. But I think there are two more principles which are about the availability of social access assistance programs and the affordability and accessibility of those. So again, like, in order to make that rights-based, we really need to think about care as very much integral. So I think that's what I needed to say. And yeah, I'd be happy to take questions and thoughts.
Great. Thanks very much, Deepta. I think that you brought in a very interesting dimension as we think about what sort of rights-based social assistance looks like, to really take into account, as you said, that the sort of the time poverty that often sort of is, an affliction, and make sure that the accessibility and the availability of the social assistance, which is supposed to be a help for many low-income people, and low-income women in particular, does not require additional time to be able to kind of meander the system and access whatever benefits are available. A very important consideration here. I will now turn, I think, to our second discussant, to Laura Alfers. Laura is, of course, the international coordinator of WIEGO, Women in the Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, which has helped us carve out WIEGO's niche in social protection, in workers' health and childcare services, and ensuring that the concerns of workers who are in the informal economy are heard by global development community and policy bodies at multiple levels, from the local to the global. So thank you, Laura, for joining us, especially now with your new responsibility as the international coordinator of WIEGO. The question I have for you is, you've done a lot of work with the networks of women workers who are part of your kind of base of your constituents, if you will. And I'm very curious to know, what are the social protection priorities of women workers in the informal economy, the ones with whom you interact and who have voiced their priorities through their networks and through some very important research that you and colleagues have done? And how does this, the voices that you hear about priorities, how does this relate to the issue of ensuring more adequate benefits, something that Deepta touched on? Obviously, this is a key international social security principle, the adequacy of benefits. And so how does that relate to adequate benefits that are provided through contributory schemes? I want to ask in particular, because people sometimes wrongly assume that women who are relatively disadvantaged working in informal economy have no interest in contributory schemes. So I want to sort of ask you, beyond social assistance, what do you hear from the networks of the women in your research and in your kind of political role? What do they say? What are the specific priorities that they have? Also, in terms of branches of social protection, we heard about unemployment protection, but also other areas. So we would love to hear your response to that.
Thanks so much, Shahra. Thanks for having me. And first of all, just a big congratulations to you and Christina and the team on this report, which I think is really important, because there's a lot that is written in the gender and social protection space, but not so much on the gender, labor and social protection space. And so it's really great to have this report just laying things out for us. I think it's a really important question to ask. So what do women working in the informal economy want to see? And it's kind of a central question. And I think, there are 4 networks associated with WIEGO of women workers in tend to be poorer occupations in the informal economy, right? So not everybody in the informal economy is poor. But amongst domestic workers, waste pickers, street traders, home-based workers, these are the sort of groups of informal workers we work with. And I think just to point out that a really big change, and I think COVID sort of accelerated this, is that all of these networks now do have positions on social protection. It actually wasn't a given 10 years ago that worker organizations, particularly amongst more vulnerable workers, even considered social protection, because it was something they just didn't have access to, never had access to, and as a policy priority, that's quite far removed from the lived reality of most workers in the world. So I think it's a real advance that we're at the point where all of these networks have something to say on social protection. And I think the latest one was at the elective conference of the International Alliance of Waste Pickers last year, them establishing a resolution on social protection, which was very exciting for us to see. StreetNet International now has a platform of demands on social protection and so on. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's been, it's actually been, that is a victory as well. And then, I spent some time preparing for this talk just by going through all of the official statements of the networks and thinking through, and I mean, I think there's 3 things that I'll highlight. And I think you've highlighted it already and in your talks, that it's not only social assistance that we're talking about. When we are interacting or trying to support workers in the informal economy to engage with national policymakers, it's very often around social insurance systems, because that is where policymakers want to include working people, and they see workers in the informal economy as working people. And so that's where the policy interaction starts happening. So we've always felt it, as the ILO is a natural home, because we can, you're one of the few organizations who are actually focusing on that area in social protection. And I think that does relate to the adequacy of benefits as well, right? Because, I mean, it's through the social insurance schemes that you tend to get the benefits that sort of are more suitable for working people. If I think of I'm based in South Africa, and I think of during the COVID crisis, the social relief of distress grant, the social assistance grant, was 1/10 the size of the temporary employee relief scheme grant that was given through the social insurance scheme, right? And if you're a working person, that higher level is, you've got some debt, maybe, you've got kids to send to school. That adequacy of benefits is really important, and it's you often find that located in the social insurance schemes. I think the biggest demand, though, and this is across all of the organizations, is that quite often those rates of contribution are set at unaffordable levels. And sometimes people will say, oh, but that's just complaining. If they really wanted to contribute, they would. But if you look at the percentages in some countries of what particularly self-employed people have to contribute, it's too high. Or it is high. We're supporting a platform of workers in Chile at the moment, engaging with the social security system, and I think it's 17% of the reference income, and workers are saying that's too high. There's a percentage we can contribute, but that's too much. And so one of the big debates is around subsidies. So actually integrating social assistance and social insurance and not seeing them as separate is one of the big issues we have to face. And of course, there are examples of places, of countries where we've seen either explicit or implicit subsidies to social insurance happening to enable poorer workers to join into the schemes. I think the ILO has been some of the forefront of doing the work to figure out, what that needs to look like in terms of the structure of schemes, but it's really important. And I think it also raises questions about, where else we raise the money from in terms of getting subsidies into the social insurance scheme. For domestic workers, we can look to employers. But what about self-employed workers? There's discussions about value chains. Can we look to value chains to raise contributory funds? And I think there's an interesting connection with the sort of movement of workers in the gig economy and the platform economy now, who's saying, well, these big corporations must also pay. And sort of older groups of informal workers saying, well, we've also tried these things. So it's interesting to see how that plays out, and perhaps in this time of new ideas, this is something we can think about. I think for the second thing, and this relates to your question about types of social protection, and if we think about what women are asking for as different from men, it often is around maternity and childcare, and that's no surprise. And it's also interesting in that quite often maternity benefits are located in the social insurance schemes as well, right? I mean, we do have a few cases where we see maternity benefits as social assistance, but very often it's in the social insurance scheme. But the second point, and it came out very clearly in what you're saying, is that people, workers in the informal economy don't always understand the difference between social insurance, social assistance, public services. They just know what they need. And what they need is integrated service provision, right? So mentioning the access to healthcare, if you look at the International Waste Pickers Alliance resolution on social protection, they've got a lot of that is about occupational health and safety services, which they see as part of social protection. If you look at StreetNet International's platform of demands, they've got childcare in there, childcare provision. They see that as central for women workers. And sometimes it's not at the national level, sometimes it's at the local level. So, for home-based workers, it can be that housing is seen as part of their social security, because for them, that's part of keeping their income stable. So there's that connection, which is important. And then just a third point, and briefly, is that you can have these benefits. I mean, it's really important to have benefits that speak to women's needs, but it's not sufficient in and of itself. And I mean, we were hearing, interestingly, about a case in Zambia where there'd been a pilot scheme to run a really generous maternity benefit through the social security scheme, and hardly anybody had signed up. Hardly any woman had signed up. And it was, I don't know what the reason for it was, but, part of it is, what has the engagement been like with worker organizations, with women's groups? What has been done to communicate about this? What social security education has been done? And how are we engaging with civil society around that? So it's a point that often gets left by the side, but it's critically important. You can design the most beautiful scheme, But if you're leaving that out, it might not do what you need it to do. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Laura. Thanks for addressing those questions so concretely. And I think the examples of what some of your networks are saying, and it is indeed great news that social protection has moved up the ladder in terms of having that kind of visibility and demand from networks that speak for the four groups that you mentioned. And also, you know, your points, I think, are very well taken with regard to social insurance being very important. And of course, you know, this issue, particularly for self-employed workers, the affordability of being able to kind of make the contributions and have contribution rates that are within their reach. And I think if I can just use this to also say there was a very nice piece done by two of our colleagues, by Florian and Luca, on this whole question of sort of thinking more about social insurance and the financing of it, which was available on Project Syndicate. And I think it does point in the same direction. If we need subsidies, where do we get that from? Where are the alternative sources of financing that can be brought into social insurance systems to really make them inclusive of people, of workers in all kinds of employment, including those who don't have an obvious employer who cannot pay the employer share, which of course means they have a double contribution rate to pay. With that, I would like to move now to our third and final discussant today, our dear colleague James Heintz. James is the Andrew Glynn Professor of Economics at University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and he has written, of course, very widely on a range of issues on economic policy, including job creation, global labor markets, global labor standards, distributive consequences of macroeconomic policies, including from a gender and race perspective, and the intersection between economics and human rights. And of course, he has also done a lot of work on what the care economy means and why it's so absolutely essential and foundational for any economy, kind of echoing the point that Deepta made about care being a public good. So James, we know that, you know, investments in social protection and in public services, and we've been talking about that, and these things are interconnected and seamless for people who need them. Many of these have many economic and social payoffs, and I've heard you talk over the years a lot about the importance of those economic, not only social payoffs, but also economic payoffs of those investments. So my question to you then is, you know, how can countries mobilize the kind of resources that they need here and now to make that investment in order to see those economic and social payoffs, especially in a context that we're in now with this debt distress that is affecting so many countries? Can you kind of throw light a bit on this issue from your perspective? Thank you.
Sure, Shahra, and thank you, and congratulations on the working paper and the report. So we've heard kind of a very comprehensive set of recommendations and thoughts about how social protection, social policy can be made more gender equitable. But how do we actually pay for all of this? That's the big outstanding question. And Shahra had organized a side event at the Financing for Development meetings at the UN earlier this year, where this issue came up. And so I thought I would touch on some of the ideas and thoughts that came out of that meeting. I'll begin by noting that the mobilization of resources, how we pay for this from both public and private sources, remains a policy choice. And it's really important to remember that. It's a constrained choice, with constraints varying from country to country, but it's still a political choice. And a central challenge that we're facing today is that the choices that are often made in terms of managing public resources, fiscal policy, limit the scope of social policies. So an obvious example of this is the trend towards fiscal consolidation, which is the latest euphemism for deficit reduction and reducing public borrowing. Or, you know, I'm participating in this webinar from the US where we currently call it government efficiency. While the sustainability of fiscal policies is important, we want to make sure debt servicing costs are manageable and that they don't crowd out areas of spending needed to fund public services. But there's a contradiction in the sense that fiscal policy often results in cuts to social protections and services necessary to meet the development objectives. Fiscal consolidation is supposed to protect in the first place. So one area, which Shahra just mentioned in kind of the introduction to her question to me, that needs more elaboration with respect to good fiscal management is the connection between social expenditures and fiscal sustainability. It's a question of fiscal sustainability. Kind of the prevalent approach takes public resource envelope is relatively fixed by the tax system, by the rate of economic growth, borrowing, debt service, and other factors. And then social spending is bound by this resource constraint. It's almost derivative of the macro framework. While this might make sense in the very short run, it ignores a critical connection that social policy, at least aspects of social policy, have long-run effects on productivity growth and ultimately the fiscal space. And the best known example of these effects is the large literature on the return to education that shows that investments in education generate significant private, but also significant social returns in terms of greater human productivity that supports a development in the long run. But it's not just education. We can look at early childhood development and some of the child care issues that have been mentioned. Jim Heckman, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, has demonstrated that investments in early childhood development have really long-run impacts on economic performance, productivity, human capacities, and so forth. And, you know, the COVID pandemic showed us the economic value of strong public health and care systems in navigating a macroeconomic crisis. So just as physical infrastructure enhances private sector productivity, investments in social infrastructure yield benefits that can support future economic growth and which undergird the public finance system. So it makes sense if we recognize this, to be able to borrow to finance these social events, these social investments, when the rate of return exceeds the interest rate paid. Effectively, the investments, these social policies become self-financing. They generate the resources in the future needed to service the debt. But, you know, if we follow a path of fiscal consolidation, it actually prevents countries from taking advantage of these opportunities for development. And the irony is that cuts to social spending deny a country the longer-term returns from investment in social infrastructure, which then compromises its ability to actually achieve fiscal sustainability in the long run. But then how do we get the ball rolling with respect to financing social expenditures in the long run when countries currently face numerous fiscal constraints? Well, I would argue that relaxing these constraints involves institutional development at the country level. And a very common focus of this type of institutional development is on the revenue collection systems, that they could be made more efficient, or that their capacity enhanced to source revenues from diverse sources, rather than just relying on a single source such as VAT, value-added taxes. But we can. So this is well recognized. You all know this. The specific recommendations would vary from country to country, depending on whether there are natural resources, the financial sector, the level of informality, and so forth. But we can think about it even more expansively in terms of the institutional changes that might be needed in the financial sectors of countries. So consider debt servicing costs. Often these are very high in developing country contexts, making investment in the economy's future much less sustainable. But what's driving these high costs? Is it just there's a lack of loanable funds that push up interest rates? Or are there other reasons, such as rent-seeking behavior that's permitted by the structure of the financial system? So let me give you an example of what I mean. Debt servicing costs on domestic debt can be higher than external borrowing, and this itself places limitations on the mobilization of domestic sources of financing for development. But why is debt service so high? In many cases, it's a result of highly concentrated domestic financial sectors where banks have enormous kind of monopoly power in underdeveloped markets such as bond markets, so that a few large players dominate the financial sector, and they have the ability to bid up the cost on domestic debt. If they bid up the cost on debt services, it squeezes, the other areas of government spending and prevents the types of social expenditures that we're talking about here. And I just want to stress that these structures aren't fixed and unchangeable. These incentive structures that are in place, they're the result of the institutions that themselves can be altered, making expenditures more sustainable and opening up fiscal space. And so these institutional changes that would allow for supporting the types of social policies that we're talking about in this webinar should be a clear part of the policy discussion. I guess the last point I would make is that it's not just domestic dynamics. There's international dynamics that come into play. So one clear example is considered the issue of illicit financial flows, flows of money that leave a country indebted, but not with the types of investments in social infrastructures that we're discussing here. These movements of money out of a country would not be possible without international actors such as the financial institutions in the global north that actually facilitate this process. And if we're thinking of other institutions in the global north that can impact social policy in developing countries, consider the role of ratings agencies. These institutions have a direct impact on debt servicing costs. A country will often adopt the types of fiscal consolidation that I've mentioned due to fears of having their bond ratings downgraded by these ratings agencies. And if their bond ratings are downgraded, debt services rise and fiscal space starts to close. But really, who are these ratings agencies and what grants them legitimacy to define the fiscal space of other countries? The rating agencies actually are US-based corporations. There's 3 of them: Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch's. They're private, profit-driven corporations. And their business model is based on kind of a fundamental conflict of interest where issuers of securities, such as government bonds, will actually pay them for the rating. Now, we can all agree that some type of risk assessment of financial instruments is necessary, but the question is whether these corporations should be granted this responsibility without clear channels of accountability. And so, I guess in closing, I would just say that these relationships, these international relationships, these domestic institutional structures that limit fiscal space need to be part of this conversation that we're having today about how to make social protection work for gender equality. Often the best policy ideas, such as those in the ILO report, are shot down by the argument that there just isn't any money to finance them. But I mean, if you look, the money's there, or it could be there. It's just simply used and directed at other purposes.
Thanks very much, James. First of all, on this whole issue that you have been, referring to for a long time about the importance of these social investments, and we know the research on childcare services by Heckman and others. And I think it's important to say there's also a kind of a growing body of literature on the sort of from a social determinants of health perspective. WHO has been doing a lot of research which shows the way in which social protection, having that kind of peace of mind, can be so good in terms of saving people's, health and having very positive health outcomes that in some ways can be seen as something very productive. In terms of mental health, which is currently a real concern, having that kind of security of knowing you have unemployment protection if you lose your job and so forth. So I think we have some work to do in terms of really bringing this evidence together to show the many, not just economic payoffs in terms of GDP. There's quite a few studies showing the multiplier effects of social protection spending in terms of GDP, but also the social and the more complex economic payoffs of these investments. So that's kind of on the one side. And then really appreciated your view about how we can really relax the constraints that these institutional constraints that you talk about in order to enable countries at the national level, but also much more challenging, the global institutional framework to really become more enabling in terms of allowing the mobilization of much needed fiscal resources to make these kind of investments that we know will have very positive social and economic effects in the medium to long term. But in the short term, how do we change that around? And I think there's some really interesting observations that you made, and we will all be looking to see what the outcome of the current negotiations in the financing for development space is going to be, because these issues about illicit financial flows, the role of rating agencies, these were all on the agenda. So very important to watch that space. We now have about 20 minutes left, which is good. I'm really thankful to all our panelists who've been very sort of structured with their responses and has given us time for Q&A. There were a couple of questions that were highlighted. I saw one that was about the fear about maternity protection, sort of increasing discrimination against hiring of women. This may be a question that maybe, Christina, you want to pick up on again. You mentioned the problems with this employer liability model and how this transition to social insurance can be helpful. But maybe you can sort of elaborate on that. Maybe there's also a few other questions. Maybe what I want to do is allow our 4 panelists to pick up the questions that you've seen in the chat. There was also a question about education as an important protection for girls, and what evidence do we have about child benefits that have been sometimes conditioned on children attending school, has effectiveness of those conditionalities, because we know there's always a lot of questions about having conditionalities on social assistance, because it also goes against the point that Deepta made about not adding to women's very limited time by adding all these conditionalities, but maybe some of the benefits of that. And examples of social insurance in particular from some of the sectors that have high levels of informality. Maybe Laura, you want to pick up on that. So I will let you come in response to some of the questions. Also, if you have any comments, responses to what you heard from colleague panelists. And maybe I will go in the order that we came. I'll start with Christina.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, and really many thanks for the questions that are coming in, but also special thanks to Deepta, Laura, and James for these very important and inspiring and stimulating, and well, not easy, not easy comments, but I think these were kind of very important ones, and I think we really need to think beyond and really look at the questions that you've raised. So let me maybe go to the specific questions on maternity protection and the question of kind of employer liability versus social insurance. And actually similar challenges exist also for other branches of social security. Whether we talk about also work injury, whether we talk about sickness benefits, it's also similar challenges. And so I think it was Sadia who raised that question. And indeed, when it comes to as important as it is to have these provisions that give the responsibility to employers for ensuring paid maternity leave or paid sick leave, etc. But if that responsibility is left to individual employers to be paid for, indeed, it can really lead to discriminatory effects on when it comes to the hiring well, especially when we talk about maternity benefits, it's women in childbearing age. And I think I think the concerns also of employers, especially when it comes to small enterprises. And I think this is, of course, I mean, you also understand these concerns because this is an important risk also for enterprises. And this is why the ILO is promoting social insurance solution in that respect, because this is really, this provides for risk pooling, and risk pooling both among workers. And I think it's very important to bring also, I mean, when it comes to maternity protection, to bring also men into the calculation. So I mean, men obviously also pay those social security contributions, but I think it's also an important risk pooling mechanisms on the side of enterprises, so that you have smaller and larger enterprises in the same risk pool. And if you look at it from the perspective of enterprises, it's much easier for an enterprise to pay a regular contribution every month, which is predictable, rather than paying kind of a very high cost in case one of the staff members is pregnant, or if there's a work accident, or if there's a kind of a long-term sickness. So, and this is why the ILO is so much insisting on having the social insurance solution when it comes to those risks, in order to have these collective financing solutions. And indeed, and I think, Laura, you also pointed to the question about kind of the tax finance mechanisms when it comes to maternity protection. And I think these can also provide an important complement, and making sure that this is really something, I mean, this maternity protection is something that is not only for, I mean, it's kind of really not excluding women who don't necessarily have the same contributory capacity. So finding these linkages, and I think there was another, and I think, Laura, it was also you who mentioned about thinking about subsidy mechanisms, or bringing kind of social insurance and tax finance mechanisms together in a more integrated way. And I think these are all mechanisms that can really help to address those challenges. So maybe with that, I'll stop here and give also hand over to whoever wants to come next.
Yeah, maybe Deepta, do you want to come in, or I'm just going in the order that you spoke, but if Laura, if you want to jump in, I'm also happy to do it that way. Deepta, why don't you come in, and then we'll hand over to Laura, and then we go to...
Thank you. No, I just wanted to add to exactly what Christina said about like the maternity, benefits, and kind of saying that, look, we need to understand also two things. One, need to take men with us. So I think I personally think it shouldn't be called maternity benefits at all. It should be called parental benefits or care benefits or whatever. And then, whoever is, eligible can take them, and including fathers. Of course, the wage disparity in the market is such that unless you make it compulsory, men won't necessarily take that leave. But I just wanted to also respond to kind of like, how one has sort of like how do we ensure that employers comply? And I think in this, in fact, I was reading a very interesting study that ILO commissioned in Delhi with the IHS, and they've kind of talked about how employers, what do employers actually think about these social protection measures, and what do they think? Do they think they're giving an adequate wage to domestic workers, etc.? And I think it's really important to take employers on board, and not kind of just say, well, there's the, they're the big bad employers, because I think it's really important to just take them on board. So that's the only two things I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Deepta. And I think on that point about maternity and parental, we can have another webinar on that because there'll be very interesting perspectives on that. And I think that would be a very interesting, actually, discussion to have. Can I ask Laura, would you like to come in? Because you
Sure.
had some specific questions also in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, examples of social protection coverage in contexts of high informality. I mean, I could talk about that here, but I think there's a huge ILO resource that Christina led, which has collated an enormous number of examples of social protection schemes in contexts of high informality. So, you know, I won't give those individual examples, but just pointing to the fact that a resource does exist, and it talks about the sort of different elements of what can allow schemes to work better in contexts of high informality. I think the point I'd like to make, though, is that, and it was made during the presentation and perhaps just needs to be highlighted again, is that you can't see social protection as something that's going to change people's lives in and of itself. It's got to be part of an integrated system of improving livelihoods, improving incomes, of structural economic change, and all of that. You know, it's always going to be difficult to get contributory schemes to cover everybody under conditions where people are struggling, under punitive conditions where their livelihoods are not supported. And so that connection between social protection and other elements of a supportive public policy system, which actually improves incomes and livelihoods, is part of the it's part of the answer to the question of how do we cover workers in the informal economy. It can't just be through social protection alone. And so I wanted to highlight that. And I mean, there's some good examples of you know, interesting schemes. I mean, India is full of, you know, India, although it's now a global economic power, is very high informality country. And there are lots of interesting examples, from workers' welfare boards to public schemes, where you know, social protection has been extended. And I think that also, if we look at the social health insurance world, which tends to sometimes be separated off a bit from social protection, you also start to see some interesting multi-level schemes, right? Multi-tiered schemes. So Indonesia, for example, has a scheme which has different layers. So there's a payment exemption for the poor, and then there's a sort of next level subsidized group of people for access to the health insurance, and then there's, you know, paid health insurance, and it's all under one scheme. And it has fairly high coverage. It's not universal, but it's fairly high. So, you know, this is not an impossibility to go to this place. It's been done in the health insurance world. I think one point, and it popped into my head from James's points about sort of rethinking the fiscal framework and stuff, and also because I've sort of moved to more general work outside of just looking at social protection, and just been working in Africa on taxation issues. And I think one of the dangers of this kind of move towards, okay, well, domestic resource mobilization that is happening in the current context is that governments do think, oh, we do have a tax collection gap, let's go for the informal economy, and let's go for the easiest targets in the informal economy as well. So just in thinking through the financing for social protection, you know, I was saying, oh, we do need to raise domestic financing for social protection, but there also needs to be a sort of caveat to that, like, let's hit the right targets for raising the revenue for social protection as well. And so that's just another area of integration that I think we need to think about. Thanks.
And last but not least, James, any responses, reactions from you, particularly in the current global sort of context that we're in terms of the fiscal issues in particular?
I didn't see a lot of questions based on the issues I raised, but I do think one just observations. I do think in all these discussions of social protection, social policy, I still think we're working in kind of silos. That social protection, social policy is siloed from the macroeconomic discussion. And what that allows is that the macroeconomic policies then set the constraints, set the constraints for the social policy discussion, as opposed to starting to see social policies as macroeconomic policies. They do have these long-run impacts. They do change the constraints of the macro economy. And I know you've heard me say this over and over again, Shahra, but I think we should still pound that message home. And I know I was flagging, in my comments, institutional change and kind of hitting at some of the more powerful institutions, the domestic banking sector. So yes, the informal sector is the easy target. Why not talk about the commercial banks for mobilizing domestic resources? Why aren't they part of that conversation? And things like the credit ratings agencies. I have kind of a weird sort of speculative optimism over the past week, where we've had almost half a century of neoliberal policies with U.S. hegemony. That's kind of the global system that we've been dealing with for 50 years at this stage. And this past week, I almost felt like there were cracks, big cracks in that. It almost felt like, and maybe it's my perspective from the US, but that the Trump administration was playing the violin while the global economy was burning, basically. I think, and the Trump administration, Modi, these authoritarian states, I think are a reaction to that kind of global neoliberalism with US hegemony. And it's happening in this authoritarian way. But I wonder if, that half a century of operating within this kind of policy paradigm is starting to change, and whether there's opportunities now to, speak truth to power and call out the major powerful institutions and have them do their part in terms of social policy and social protection.
I think that is a perfect note on which to end. And I really want to take up that point that you made about, we have been constantly sort of thinking about social policy, social protection within the constraints set by macroeconomic policies. And really, it's important to sort of question this binary, this artificial binary that we've created when we know social investments, social protection, social policies have huge macroeconomic impacts and can shift the macroeconomy in very important and positive ways. So I think that's a good note to end on. I want to say a big thank you to our socialprotection.org colleagues, and also my colleagues Kriti and Anna Carolina, who have been working very diligently behind the scenes with socialprotection.org colleagues to make this webinar possible. A huge thank you also to Deepta, Laura, James, and Christina, and of course, everyone who joined and was patient enough to stay for an hour and a half to have this conversation. We really think making social protection more gender responsive is a constant, requires this kind of constant ongoing conversations of the kind we've just had over the past hour and a half to really be able to truly implement positive changes, learn from what's happening on the ground in terms of policy innovations, policy changes, and experiences, taking lessons from that. And really be able to make those kind of positive structural changes that we talked about. Maybe not some of the very big structural changes immediately, but still making sure the policy design and implementation is aligned with our well-recognized international social security standards. The working paper that was referred to in today's discussions is one of the steps in that direction. And we really look forward to the work that we all do on this and work together for a brighter and better future. With that, and thanking all of you, I wish you a very good rest of day, evening, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.